Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Bikini Bottom. My name is Steven Mendoza, and I'm an educator at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. Thank you so much for joining us today for our very special program titled Dive into the Science of SpongeBob, Get to Know Gary the Sea Snail. Just so you know, this is going to be about a 45-minute program with the last 15 minutes reserved for questions. So if you have any questions about anything you see, please submit them to the Zoom chat feature. If you have to leave early or if you get disconnected, that is A-okay. I'm going to be uploading this entire program onto the Natural History Museum's YouTube page, so you can watch it again and again as many times as you like, and go ahead and give it a like if you'd like. Before we kick things off, I would also like to thank our partners from Nickelodeon. With their support, the Natural History Museum will be exploring the science of SpongeBob all month long. Every Tuesday and Thursday, one of our museum educators will host a casual, kid-friendly conversation with a marine science expert, diving into a variety of topics from sea snails to ancient sponges to fascinating fish. So, with all that being said, let's get to know Gary. Here is a picture of my friend Gary. I have one right here. Get to know Gary the sea snail. There we go. Here is a picture of our friend Gary. Based on what I have learned from watching SpongeBob, I know that Gary is a sea snail, but in all honesty, besides that, I don't really know much about him. Working at the Natural History Museum, I've learned that we can get to know new animals by doing two very important things. The first thing we can do to get to know a new animal is we can observe them. So today we're going to use our nature eyes and we're going to look closely at this animal and see what we notice. The second thing you should do when you get to know a new animal is you should ask questions. Asking questions is a very important part of the scientific process. So today we're going to be taking all of our questions to an actual sea snail scientist. Joining me today is the Natural History Museum's Associate Curator of Malacology, Jann Vendetti. Hi, Jann, welcome.
Hi, Steven. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here and helping us answer all these questions about this amazing sea snail. I have so many slides and we're ready to go.
Great.
So first and foremost, I know that you're an expert on animals like Gary because you study malacology. Can you tell us a little bit about what malacology is?
Yeah, malacology is the study of mollusks. So mollusks include snails, clams, squid, octopus. That whole group of invertebrates, animals without backbones, is called mollusks. And gastropods, that's the scientific name for snails, that's the biggest group. So there are the greatest number of species out of all of the mollusks within the gastropods or the snails. And that's snails that you see outside when it rains, or snails that live in the ocean, like Gary.
Fascinating. Okay, so there's all kinds of animals that are very closely related to Gary, it sounds like.
Yeah,
But
go
yeah,
ahead.
go ahead. I was just going to say the first thing that I notice when I look at Gary is I see a very big pink spiral shell. Can you tell us a little bit about that shell and why do they have that spiral in the middle?
Absolutely. So snails, as you all probably know, if you've seen any snail, right? A snail crawling across the sidewalk, Gary, cartoon snails, or like I said, a living snail. Um, Most snails have a shell, not all snails. So slugs are snails that don't have a shell, and there are sea slugs and land slugs, but most gastropods, remember that's a scientific name for snails, most gastropods have a shell. And just like a turtle, right, they're not closely related to turtles at all, but just like a turtle, they are attached to their shell. They can't leave it and come back. It grows with them. So when they're a little baby, their baby self just has a shell and it continues to grow just like that. Thank you, Stephen. Their little baby self is that tiny little shell that you see in the middle, that first little whirl of a shell that you see in the middle, and then their shell continues to grow and grow and grow and grow and grow throughout their life. So that's evolution's way of fitting an animal into a hard exoskeleton. So there's a lot of different ways that animals have evolved to have hard parts on the outside and soft parts on the inside. It's sort of the opposite of us, right? When you think of your hard parts, there's the bones inside your body. We don't have an exoskeleton. But if you think of like spiders and crabs and insects, they all have their exoskeleton on the outside. And then like that, mollusks mostly have an exoskeleton on the outside, which is their
Wow.
shell. And
So
that
you're telling me,
spiral, yeah, and their spiral is just a way to fit kind of a long bodied animal into a small space. So that whole shell is taken up inside by parts of the animal.
oh, I had no idea any of those things. So they have their shells ever since they're little babies?
That's right. And some of them in the ocean, some little baby snails will swim. They have these two, it looks like wings. They're called velar lobes or velum. So imagine my head. Yes, exactly. Imagine my head is a little baby snail, and on the side of me, I have these little wings, but they're sort of in a way kind of like flippers, kind of,
Okay.
and they move around in the water. And so that it's called a larva or a little baby snail swims around, and then it settles, which means it drops to the ocean floor. Those velar lobes are lost, and then it starts to crawl on its foot, which is what you see when you see a picture of Gary or any snail. It has eyes here, and then a shell. Imagine here's a shell, and then its foot is what it moves around on. So it's
Okay.
moving around on its foot, and then its shell is attached, and then continues to grow through most of its life.
That is so fascinating. So you said we have eyes here. I see Gary's eyes,
That's
and I
right.
see the foot. I assume the foot is that bottom yellow squiggly
Yes,
part on Gary.
looks
Okay.
like it. Yep.
And we have the shell, which is completely full of animal. I
Yep.
had no idea.
Yep, their intestines. So just like you have, like where you digest your food, it goes through different tubes in your body that we call intestines. They have that too. They have a whole digestive system, and much of their digestive system is curled up into the top of that shell.
Okay. Wow. Fascinating. We have another snail here. This is really cute. I guess that's a sea snail as well.
But that's a sea snail. That's a group. It's a sea snail in a group, a family. Just like you have a family in the non-human animal world, different groups of organisms, different groups of animals are organized into categories that are called families. So within the mollusks, there are different families, or within the mollusks, there are the gastropods. Remember, that was a scientific word for snail. And then within the gastropods, there are different families of gastropods. And that, Stephen, the picture that you're showing is a snail in a family called the strombids or the strombidae. That's the Latin name, the strombidae. And they have some really interesting features that are very much like Gary, which you may talk about.
Let's talk about him. We have more pictures of Gary to look at. This is one of my all-time favorite pictures of Gary. And when I look at this picture, one thing that I notice with my observation eyes is that Gary is leaving behind a very large, sticky looking trail of slime.
Mm-hmm.
Why does Gary have slime, and what do they do? What do snails do with their slime?
Good question. The very first and probably most important thing that snails, the reason that they have slime is that they have to move along a surface on a it's called tissue, right? Like your skin is a tissue or an organ, but you could think of it as a tissue, right? It's something that your body makes. And as that snail is moving, it has to be able to kind of slide and slip along a surface. And that surface is sand or gravel or dirt or a tree if it's living on land or in trees. In the ocean, it's rocks and sand and things like that. And it has to be able to smoothly move over that surface. And if it were dry, even if it wet in the ocean, but if it didn't have any slime on it, it would be very difficult for it to move. So it being slimy and slippery lets it move over. So what it's making, its foot and other parts of its body make mucus. So it's very similar to like what happens when you have a runny nose. It's almost the same kind of material that their body makes, and it's making it on its foot so it can slip and slide and move along a surface.
Wow.
And they use it for all sorts of different things too. So it's for movement, but they can also put chemicals in that slime that tell other snails, here I am, if they want to meet another snail, or predators, sometimes predator snails. So some snails eat algae, like things like seaweed, but some snails eat other snails. So
Wow.
Imagine it's a snail moving along, it's leaving a slime trail because it has to, because it's moving along with its, to move over the sediment or the sand or whatever it rocks. And then there's a predatory snail. That means a snail that eats other animals. So it's it's going to trying to find that snail to eat it. And
I didn't even know we have those.
yes, yes. And they can smell. They're not the way that you
How do
do
they
with the
smell?
nose. They have two sets. So Gary only has one set of what are called optical tentacles, right? You can see his eyes on the tips of those little tentacles. Most
Right.
snails have additional, either two more tentacles on the bottom or next to their eye stalks, right? Those
Okay.
optical tentacles, they have like
Yeah.
another little tentacle that comes off. And then they sometimes also have like a tube that then they pull water through, and then they have an organ inside their body that is indicating chemicals. So they can they can smell, basically they can sense that there are chemicals around, and then the predatory snail can find that other snail based on its slime trail and
Wow.
find it and eat it.
Okay. So they use their slime to move, and certain snails can use other snails' slime to hunt. Wow. What more do they
Exactly
use
right.
their slime for?
Some snails can, and slugs especially, can put chemicals in their slime that are very distasteful, which means
Ooh.
tastes awful to predators.
Okay.
So it's a way that they can protect themselves from predators, like especially if they have no shell. So imagine you're a snail with a shell. If some animal is coming towards you, you can pull yourself into your shell, and your shell is like your little house that's protecting you.
A
But if
safe space.
That's right. But if you're a slug, you have no capacity to do that because you don't have a shell. So what evolved in a lot of slugs is a lot of different strategies for telling predators or teaching predators not to eat them. So if you have chemicals in your body that taste really bad, a predator might try to eat you and then spit you out. So
Oh.
some slugs will put that chemical in their slime
Oh,
to make
okay.
themselves taste awful.
Wow. Okay. So slime is very useful, helps Gary move. Potentially, it could potentially help him avoid being eaten because
Defend
he just
himself. Yes,
defend
that's
himself.
right.
Fascinating. Slime, the most useful stuff on the planet. Let's see. And speaking of predatory snails, which I did not know existed until right now, I have this fun picture. Um, Here we go. So when I look at this picture, I see that Gary has some big, sharp, scary teeth. Is that something that snails have?
Not in the way that Gary has them. So if you were to see a snail's mouth, you with your human eyes would not be able to see its teeth. There are no snails in which you could see its actual teeth, but they
Okay.
do, Stephen. They do have teeth.
Ooh. Okay. Let's hear more about those teeth. I actually have some pictures of snail teeth.
So look at that. So I wonder if anybody who's watching, if you're all asking, like, what is Steven showing? This doesn't look like, what are these? So snails and slugs have a ribbon of teeth. So imagine if you've ever been licked by a cat, right? You know how a cat tongue feels really rough.
I do.
Snails and slugs all have, you could think of it like a tongue, and it's called a rib. It's the scientific name for it is a radula, radula. So it's your word of the day, radula.
Radula. Let's all say
So
it together. Radula.
very
That's a
good,
fun one.
yes,
I like that.
radula. So one radula, two radulae, which is fun. It's a Latin
Radulae.
word.
Okay.
Anyway, so a radula is this ribbon of teeth, and it is so tiny that it's hard to see even with a light microscope. So like a microscope that you would use in school, for example, or a scientist would use that has lights on it. So we use a scanning electron microscope, which is a microscope that zooms in really, 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 really close, and you can see you can see the teeth that are on this radula of whatever snail. So we have a lot of snail specimens in the museum, and one difference between them, if they look very similar to each other, sometimes the radula is different between species. And
I
that's
see.
important if we're trying to figure out we're trying to study biodiversity, like how many species there are, or how different species are between each other. So what are their differences?
Oh,
One of the things that we would look at as a scientist is their radula. So this is another species. This is a land snail. This is a radula of a land snail, and you can see that they're different between the picture that you just showed and this
yeah.
picture. They're quite different from each other, and some have like big, long. They look sort of like spears. Like they can be very,
Let's
very
see.
different. This is a good example. This is a predatory. This is from a predatory snail, Stephen. So this is a
That's
snail that
horrifying.
eats other snails, and its tongue, right? Its little ribbon tongue structure has very different shaped teeth. So the little bits on this, maybe I didn't mention this already, but those little pointed things that you see there, each of those is called a tooth. So
Oh, okay. So they have very many teeth on
they
the
have many
radula.
teeth. Yes. So the
Okay.
radula is this feeding ribbon, and then on it there can be, depending on the species and depending on the group of snails, there might be as few as like 10 teeth to thousands of teeth.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is incredible. We have very many radulae here,
That's
right?
right. Very
Yeah.
good. That's right.
Amazing. What is this?
Mm-hmm. That is of a sea slug. It's a sea slug that myself and a number of colleagues where we are in Southern California study. It is a radula, but it's highly modified. So, so there are many, like the picture that you previously showed has many rows of teeth.
Right.
This radula, all of those have been reduced to one row. So they only have one row of teeth, and they use it instead of rasping. So I didn't discuss how they eat. So imagine like you're a cat tongue, or if you don't know what that feels like, just imagine almost like sandpaper is rubbing up against a surface. That's what most snails use when they have. Can you show that other picture, Stephen? The one with
This one?
either one. Yeah, that's perfect. Any
Okay.
of those, right? So all of those teeth are, the word we use is rasping, which means that it's just like scraping. So that
Oh,
tongue is scraping against, let's say, if this is a land snail, let's say it's scraping against like a carrot, right? Or a leaf.
okay.
And it's breaking up that into tiny little pieces of food that then that animal, that slug or snail can eat. But in the
Oh,
case of that sea slug, where that just had that one, like that single kind of horse, yes, it's using the very tip of one of those teeth to pierce a piece of algae. Just like imagine it's like a straw. Like imagine the piece of algae is like a straw filled with yummy goodness, right? That you want to eat.
that
And
sounds great.
you poke into it as a sea slug, and then you suck out the inside. So they're
Oh,
eating or drinking or slurping the inside material from different kinds of algae, which is like an ocean plant. I mean, there can be different kinds of algae, but in that case, it's like an ocean plant. So they're sucking up, they're using that as a little to pierce it, and then they're sucking out the inside.
that is so fascinating. So
Yeah.
we went over a lot here. I think some of the coolest things that I took away is that you, as a malacologist, can actually tell the difference between this snail and this snail,
Yeah.
which is very fascinating because they almost look the same to me. So lots of studying there. And also, Gary, this is fiction. We know that now.
Yeah.
Gary
But
would
they
never
do
bite.
yes, they do have teeth. It's just not like our teeth.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they don't chew, but
No.
they're like sandpaper. They scrape things and they just ingest it that way.
Yep. They break it up into little pieces and then swallow it. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is very interesting. I had no idea snails did any of this stuff. This is very cool. What an amazing critter. I love
Yeah.
snails. Gary, you're amazing. Getting more amazing every day. I wonder what you're scraping up under there. Where on Gary is the mouth?
So that's not really easy to see on Gary, but on any snail, the mouth is just forward of the eye stalks. So if you're
Okay.
right, so if you're looking at the eyes or the eye stalks, imagine
Eye stalks.
this little part of my hand. If you're looking at me, it's
Okay.
just this would be the mouth, and they have
Okay.
they have a structure where they have, their radulas inside, and they have like a little hole for a mouth, just like most animals. Yeah.
Okay. So we've learned a whole lot. We've learned that Gary has had this shell since he was a little baby, and that tip of that spiral there, that was likely how big Gary was when he was a baby. And he has grown in a spiral like that his entire life, right? And that shell is used to protect him
That's
and
right.
for defense. We've learned that he uses slime to travel and also to maybe find other snails if he wanted to follow their slime trail. We
Mm-hmm.
also learned that he has teeth, but he can't bite like the way we think of. He's a scraper.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, that's amazing. And we're learning a whole lot about Gary. Um, I do have a question because I love Gary, and after learning so much about him, I would love to protect Gary. And what I'm just curious about, what are some of the things that we can do, you and I and the sea stars and sponges from home, what can we do to help protect animals like Gary?
Yeah, that's a great question, Stephen. So a lot of habitats in the ocean are threatened from a variety of sources. So one is development. That just means that part of the coast where they lived is being used for something else. So it's being used for a port, like things that are necessary for human survival. But nonetheless, that changes the environment. So it's used by, sometimes a resort is built there. Sometimes a coastline is changed so that people's homes and like a golf course or something would be close to the coast, and it might change the habitat that's there. But so that's one, is their habitat can be changed just by physically moving things around and reducing it so that it's not the habitat that it used to be. Also, pollution is a big problem for marine life. Like most of us, if we were to see something that was made out of plastic, we would not accidentally eat it, right? Like you would know the difference between your sandwich in a plastic bag and the plastic bag, and you wouldn't eat the plastic bag. But if you were an ocean animal, especially the kinds of ocean animals that eat things that look like jellyfish, for example. So this is not for snails, but this is for things like sea turtles. Plastic bags can very easily end up in the ocean, and if they're floating, they might look like something that animal would naturally eat, and then so they end up eating them, and they can't digest it, so it gets stuck in their stomach, and it becomes something that could cause them to become very sick and even die.
Oh, that's
In the
awful.
case, in the case of smaller creatures like Gary and his friends, the gastropods, there are tiny little bits of plastic. So the things that we have that are plastic often don't break down or decompose within our lifetime. It takes a really long time for those plastics to decompose, like sometimes hundreds of years, or
Wow.
at least 100 years. But what might happen, and what typically happens, is that they break down into smaller and smaller pieces, which we might think is a good thing, and to some degree is a good thing. Maybe it's better that they're broken down into small pieces than being just big pieces of plastic over time. But then the problem is they don't decompose the way that, like, if you threw an apple core into a pile of dirt over a couple weeks, it would be gone, right? All of that material
Right.
that made up the apple would have completely decomposed, so that now, and fungus would have been part of decomposing it, and bacteria, and then you wouldn't even see the apple core anymore. But for plastics, they don't do that. They just become tinier and tinier pieces of plastic. And then that can become part of the sand and part of the ocean bottom. And it could be something that animals as small as Gary are eating. And then
Oh,
just the same way that a plastic bag in the stomach of a sea turtle is going to fill up that stomach and make it unable to eat and live, it could be the same for what are called micro means small, microplastics in some of these environments for invertebrate or small creatures like Gary and other gastropods. So that's
that's
a
awful.
bummer. The only
Yeah.
thing we can do as people is to try to use less plastic when we can, and to make sure that our plastic trash goes in the trash or in the recycling if it can be recycled, and that it doesn't end up in our waterways. But the best thing you can do is try to reduce the amount of plastic that you use in the first place. But that is a hard thing to do. So so if you can do it, every little bit is something. and that's good.
That's great. Yeah, we all need to use less plastic. I don't blame them for accidentally eating plastic. I've been fooled by some very convincing looking plastic fruit. So please pick up your trash, everybody. Do not litter.
That's right.
It ends up in the ocean, and we want to protect our friends at Bikini Bottom 100%. Absolutely. What about their shells? Is there anything we could do to like protect their shells? I've heard things about how there are certain things we're using on our bodies, or I don't know. I don't know much about it. You're the doctor here.
Yeah.
But you go into the ocean. Yeah.
Yeah. So I could say that there are some there's some ingredients in certain sunscreens that can be problematic for reefs. So those are a different animal. Those are corals that are making reefs. So like, for example, in Hawaii, there are certain sunblocks that are allowed and certain sunblocks that are not allowed, because the chemicals in some sunblocks can interfere with I'm not sure if it's corals making their coral, or if it's toxic to them and they'll die. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but they don't want that chemical from people swimming around coral reefs to waft over to the coral and then damage the coral. I don't think people want that either. It's just hard to know what chemicals do that. So now they've put in place regulations that keep bad, problematic chemicals in those sunblocks out of the ocean. Yeah, global warming. So as the Earth gets climate change, as the Earth gets warmer, there's quite a bit of conversation among scientists that will and the increase in carbon dioxide will increase ocean acidification. If any of you have heard of that it makes the water, there's carbon dioxide can make carbonic acid, which is an acid that it's natural. Like when it rains, there's carbonic acid in rain, but that because it falls through the atmosphere. But if you have increased amounts of carbonic acid or this carbon dioxide acid in the ocean, it can make the ocean more acidic, even slightly. And the shells of gastropods are made out of calcium carbonate. It's a little bit like your teeth. Your teeth are a material called calcium phosphate. So it's calcium plus phosphorus. And some other things, but in shells, it's calcium and carbon dioxide or carbon and some other things. And when acid and calcium carbonate interact, it will basically dissolve some of that calcium carbonate. So their shells will become thinner, and that can be not a big problem for some big thick shells, but it can be a problem for deep sea creatures that make very thin shells. And then also, do you remember at the very beginning I was talking about if you're a little larval snail,
yeah, we did this,
right? And you swim around with your little velar lobes or velum, you have a very thin shell at that time. You hatch out of an egg as a little baby snail, and you might be swimming around and your shell's very fragile at that point. And if the ocean is more acidic, your shell might have holes in it. Your shell might not be strong enough to keep your body in it. And then if that's the case, then you could die. That those snails might die without ever really before they even settle and then live their life as a snail.
My goodness.
So that's another reason that we should be very aware of how much carbon dioxide we as different countries and societies are producing. So we want to use more, if we can, renewable sources of energy, things that don't produce a lot of carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere, because that will end up in the oceans.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, well, this has been very informative. Be sure to keep an eye out. Yeah, you got that? Keep an eye out for reef safe sunblock, and also look for ways that you can lower your carbon footprint. And we're doing this not just for us, but for the Garys of the world. And I think that's very important. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and now it's just us again. And we actually have some great questions from our viewers, and I can find them for us. Let's see. Okay, so we have, oops, I'm clicking the wrong button. We have a question from Emma, and Emma would like to know, how many different species of sea snails are there?
Thanks, Emma. That's a great question. There In total, all gastropods, so all snails, there are probably around 70,000 or so.
Wow,
And
70,000.
that's 70,000 is a lot. 70,000 is, yeah, that's a lot of species. So about half of that, or between 35,000 and 40,000 species, are sea snails. So
Okay.
sea snails and land snails are almost even in diversity, in biodiversity. So there's almost as many. It's not, it's hard to count because there's so many, but there's almost the same number, as far as we know, of sea snails as there are land snails. But a lot of those species also have not been described by scientists. So there are thousands and thousands of sea snails that scientists have not described. So they don't
Wow.
have a name. We don't know how they're different from other species. So there's a lot more work for me to do, and other
Wow. So
malacologists.
yeah, so if any of you at home want to study animals like Gary all your life, it's really fun and you can become a malacologist and maybe you'll find a new snail. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
you can name it Gary. I don't know. I have some questions that are kind of similar. One was asked by Lizette and one was asked by Vanessa. And both of them say that Bikini Bottom looks like a very nice place to visit. But they're curious if animals like SpongeBob and Gary and Patrick the sea star would all live together in harmony in ocean habitat. So do we
Oh
see
yeah.
like places where there's sponges and sea stars and snails all together?
Yeah, the most biodiverse, the most places in the ocean are coral reefs. So it's, if you think of rainforest on Earth, that there are so many species in that particular habitat. The coral reefs are like that for in the ocean. There's also very, very close in biodiversity are kelp forests, which are close to our Southern California coast. We have kelp forests, and they almost are as diverse as some coral reefs. So in those habitats, you can have sea stars and sponges and snails and who else? Who am I missing, Stephen?
Ooh,
Squid,
Squidward.
octopus. Yeah,
Yeah.
they can all live in that habitat.
Yeah.
They use that habitat differently, right? So
Okay.
some
Yeah. Crabs.
live in crevices of rocks, rock crevices. Some live at the base of, like, let's use our kelp forest as a habitat. Some use the base of kelp. So if you don't know what kelp is, it's like a big, big, very fast growing seaweed. And it has what's called a hold
Some
fast at the bottom. That's right. So a hold
something
fast is
like
like the
that.
roots. It's kind of like the
So
roots
down
of,
here.
that's right. And some snails and other creatures will live among the sort of bits of the holdfast, so the sort of roots of the kelp. Some snails have evolved to live on the kelp frond, or sort of the kelp leaf, so they'll live there and only there. Yeah, there are some species have evolved to camouflage to different algae that are living in a particular habitat, so they'll look, say, green just like the algae that they live on, or brown just like the algae that they live on. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Or
So
they'll look like the
speaking,
sponge that they eat. Sorry, I'm just throwing that out there.
oh,
There are a lot of sea slugs that look like the food that they eat. So they'll live on a sponge and eat a sponge, and they'll also look like that sponge. So it's very hard for a predator to see them.
that is fascinating. And that kind of answers one of our questions, but I mean, feel free to elaborate more. We have a lot of people that are very curious about what color snails come in. I have someone that's saying they really
Mm-hmm.
like purple and pink snails.
Oh,
Megan said they
sure.
really like purple and pink snails. Matthew wants to know what color snails come in. Everyone's curious. What colors
Yes,
can snails come in?
they are almost every color you can think of. There is I can almost guarantee, yes, I can pretty much guarantee that any color you can think of, there are, especially sea slugs that come in those colors. So a lot of
Wow.
times the shell of if you think of shells, like shells can be of snails, shells can be all different, lots of different colors, but a shell is typically not like bright pink in most situations. Sometimes it
Okay.
is, but most of the time, the animal is there's more variety in the animal coloration. So in
Hmm.
Southern California, we have one of the most vibrantly colored sea slugs in the whole world, and it's called a Spanish shawl. I wonder if I can put the scientific name in the chat. And then
Sure.
if you all wanted to look at a picture of it, so it's Phalaenopsis iodinea, and it is a purple and orange sea slug that lives in Southern California. And we have
Ooh.
lots of different sea slugs. The whole world, everywhere in the world, there are sea slugs that are very brightly colored. And sometimes that bright color is a warning that that animal has poisons in its body or
Oh.
poisons in its slime. And so it's like a warning to its predators, don't eat me.
So this beautiful purple orange snail that you're talking about, it lives in the beach where we go to the beach. It lives in the Pacific Ocean right
Yeah.
here.
Yes. Yeah. So it's a sea slug. So it has no shell and it
Oh, it's a
lives.
sea slug.
But slugs and snails are very closely related. They're both
Okay.
gastropods. So
Okay.
it lives in the rocky coast. So if you go to um, tide pools in Southern California, it would, if there's a low tide, which means that the tide pools have a lot of water in them and a lot of creatures that you can find. This species is not that. It's relatively common.
Oh, okay.
It's remarkable. If you go out on a good low tide where you get to see a lot of creatures in tide pools, you may find one, and it's unmistakable. They're absolutely beautiful.
That sounds like a super fun time. I would love to go look for brightly colored sea slugs, getting my snails and slugs mixed up. I have a question from Nellie, and Nellie would like to know if snails are good swimmers. Can they see underwater when they're swimming?
Oh wow! So snails, let's see. Snails, are they good swimmers? Some sea slugs, not so much snails. Some sea slugs, that's like a tongue twister, can move like and sort of undulate and swim through the
Okay.
water. There is a whole group of sea snails called pteropods that are swimming. I'll put that word in the chat too. They are swimming snails, so they don't ever touch the ocean floor. They swim their
Oh,
whole lives. So remember I was mentioning that little velar lobe, that little larva
yeah.
snail that swims around? There are some snails that do that for their whole life.
Oh,
And then,
cool.
yeah, and then there are other groups of snails that have a very modified body. They don't have a shell, a coiled shell, but they swim around. So
Oh,
I'll see if I can find a good example of that. Here's a good
so
example.
something that you said earlier that kind of shocked me a little bit, and I didn't even talk about it, was you said that there are snails that live on sponges and they look like the sponges that they're eating.
Mm-hmm.
So snails eat sponges. Some snails eat
Yeah.
sponges. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, because
Yes.
SpongeBob and
Yes.
Gary,
That's
that's
right
that's his
there.
pet.
Yes, that kind of throws that dynamic out of whack a little bit.
Yeah.
That's
That's
right.
interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So I have a question from Stephanie, Sarah, and Julie. And Stephanie, Sarah, and Julie would like to know, Gary meows in the show, but do
Huh.
snails make any kind of noise or sounds?
Typically they don't. So they
Okay.
definitely do not meow, right? They
Okay.
definitely do
Right.
not make that sound. They don't typically make sound. Any sound that they make is sort of incidental to what they're doing. So for example, if you were being very quiet, but I heard you walking across the floor, across your floor at
Mm-hmm.
home because you were wearing shoes, or I could hear you walking in your socks, I could hear you, but you're not making that sound on purpose, like the way that I am when I'm talking, for example.
Okay.
So snails are the same way. You can hear them eating sometimes. If you're close enough, you can hear that radula rasping. Um, yeah,
Oh.
but no, they are not, they do not make sound.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting. Okay, so they do not make sound. So
And
Gary
as far,
going,
yeah,
meow, that doesn't happen.
no. And as far as we
Okay.
know, they cannot hear.
Really?
Yes, they have no structure or organ that would be auditory. So that means
Oh,
hearing. So they don't have ears.
they don't
They
have
have no
ears.
ears. So as far as we know, they cannot hear.
Wow, you heard it here, folks. Snails cannot hear you.
Right.
That is so fascinating.
It's possible that depending on what snail it is, that they can maybe pick up vibrations and maybe they use that information somehow to inform themselves about the world around them. But
Uh-huh.
they can't, they don't have they don't have ears. For
Oh,
sure.
okay.
Yeah.
That is interesting. Okay, so feel free to yell at snails, folks. They're not going to hear you. Okay. So we have a question here from Xavier, and Xavier would like to know, do snails actually need their shells?
Yes.
Yes, they do.
Yes. They need them. They can't leave them and come back to them. They need them for protection, and their body is attached to their shell. So
Okay.
yeah,
They cannot be
they
removed. Their shells cannot be
you
removed.
cannot remove a shell without killing the animal. So it
Okay.
would be like the best example to help, usually to help me remember it or to help me teach it to people, is to think of a turtle. Like a
Okay.
turtle requires its shell and its body is attached to its shell. So the snail is the same
Okay.
way. Yeah.
Fascinating. Let's see, what more questions we have? We have some people asking how old Gary is, and I think after watching this this little talk that we've had, I think I could answer that.
Go ahead, Steven.
Yeah, so we can tell how old Gary is based on how large his shell is, right? So I see only like one spiral. Does that mean he's not really that old?
That's a good,
Good
I would say
guess.
that's a good hypothesis. That is a good
Okay.
hypothesis. What we would have to do as scientists is to, if Gary were a species, we would have to track a baby version of Gary
Oh,
every year and see how fast that snail would grow and how big they get, because some snails they have very few whorls and then they're done and they're an adult.
okay.
So, right, a whorl is like, how many spirals do you have of that shell? You might
Okay.
there are snails that might grow many, many whorls, and they might grow them really fast. And they might be like 1 year old and have 6 whorls. Or there might be a shell that has 1.5 whorls, but it's 10 years old, because it just
Oh,
takes a long time. That's just how it evolved, to have a shell that is only 1.5 spirals. So
okay.
you have a good hypothesis, but just like as scientists, we would have to test it.
We have to test it. Okay, interesting. So we have time for about one more question. And I see, well, yeah, you kind of covered this one. A lot of people want to know, how long does it take for a snail to grow up from a baby to an adult?
It can be it's highly variable, which means
Okay.
I can't give you an answer, because there are 75,000 different species at least of snails, and they all have their own timelines. So
Okay.
some snails can get at least to be 20 years old, and then other snails are probably a year to 2 years.
20
Some
years old.
snails, some bivalves, which are like a cousin lineage to snails, like a clam. There are some clams that can live over 100 years.
Over 100 years. Wow.
So, but most people, like myself included, I am not studying how old snails get. So if people aren't studying it, then no one knows. So even now, despite all of the what we know about biodiversity, no one really has a good answer to that question. So that's exciting, because that means there's much more to do, and more questions to ask and questions to answer.
There are so many mysteries still surrounding these snails. Amazing. And so many of you with so many great questions about them. Sounds like we have a lot of malacologists coming our way, right, Jen?
That's right. Bring it on, everybody. Keep asking those questions about snails and everything else.
That is amazing. Well, Jan, we're about at the end of our time together today. It's been a whole 45 minutes. Thank you so much for answering all my questions, and for all the questions that you've answered from everyone from home. I think everyone here is very grateful that you had some time to share with us today.
I had so much fun, everybody. And thank you, Steven. And yeah, I'll see you next time.
We'll see you next time. So folks, that's about the end of our program. I would like to thank our amazing partner at Nickelodeon for helping us put on these very fun programs for you. Don't forget to join us every Tuesday and Thursday of this month to continue learning about our friends at Bikini Bottom and the science of SpongeBob. For more fun activities and videos, please visit nhm.org/SpongeBob. But that's about it from us, folks. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.